All right, Nehemiah chapter 2. We've seen in chapter 1 he had this burden. He's been put in position, in a high-ranking position in Persia. He's the king's cupbearer. Nehemiah has heard from his brother that things are not good. His countenance is such that the king knows it's not good, which is a really amazing testimony to Nehemiah. Like, this is the first time I've really seen you down. Something must be up. And he's asked to go to Jerusalem. He ends up, remember they say how long? He says, I'm not sure. He ends up going there for 12 years. So this is more than a few days off. Nehemiah has gotten all of this stuff. Again, God is using these kings. Artaxerxes is giving him all of this stuff. And he asks for a letter to Asaph, the manager, in verse 8 of the king's forest, that would give him timber. And God has basically done the same thing again. He keeps doing it, using neighbors, using kings, using people to get in the hands of his people what exactly was needed. Remember in Ezra, when they needed to go back, they got all the temple stuff back. God's just done it from Ezra 1 all the way through. God has provided. In verse 11, it's a 4-month journey, about 800 or 900 miles. Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem in verse 11. Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. And he doesn't do anything for 3 days. Maybe he's taking a nap, power nap. But for 3 days, he's there. He's in Jerusalem. And people must think, what's going on? I mean, he has an entourage with him. He has stuff. But he's there, and in 3 days. And then in verse 12, it says, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. This is amazing. Nehemiah is such an amazing leader. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. He's such an amazing leader. He does both. He plans and he understands, but he also has faith in that. And honestly, that's why, again, I've told you this before, but I really believe that's part of why God put me and Tasha together. Building the wall and thinking about the wall, I'd be all over that. I love stuff like that. Like, hey, Tasha, we're going to build the wall. Awesome. How? I don't know. That's exactly why I have Tasha. Because if someone said, we need walls, get it done, I'd be pumped. I'd be like, man, I love that. I'm going to walk by faith. We're going to do this. And I can see it, right? I can see it done. And I'm like, oh, it's going to get done. And then someone comes to me and says, what's the scale or what kind of material we're using? And I was like, And that's where Tasha's like, hey, you need to think about, okay, well, all right. And we get it done. But this is remember, it's been down since all those years ago when they got sent to Babylon. So they've had the 70 years of captivity. They've had all of this time, and there's still no walls. All of this time has transpired, 100-odd years, and there's still no walls. And there's still this defeat, and there's still these problems. And Nehemiah is God's man, and God has anointed Nehemiah. He's put him in position. He's given him all that he needs, and he gets to Jerusalem. And he says, and you imagine, and there's some wisdom in this, right? Have you ever had a God speak to you and you tell people and they just don't get it? Or maybe they discourage you. Or maybe they start like, well, you can't do that, blah, 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 blah. Nehemiah has this thing. He's got to Jerusalem. He ain't messing around. He isn't just thinking about it. He's acted on it. He's prayed for favor, and Artaxerxes has given him a free pass to go. And he's in Jerusalem, and he's there, and he takes 3 days. And it says he slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. Who do you suppose he took? He takes those who are close to him, those of the same heart and mindset. These aren't just anybody's. These aren't somebody that's going to be, oh, we can't do this. It's going to be people he can trust. And he's not even fully telling everything that's in his heart yet. He just takes a few people with him. And there's this planning side of Nehemiah, which is much more Tasha's skill set. It's one thing to hear your brother say, the walls are down. It's another thing to go and inspect it for yourself. It'd be kind of like 9/11. It's one thing hearing about it. It's another standing on the rubble. There had to be something powerful about standing on the rubble in 9/11, right? And that's what he's doing. He's standing on the rubble from God's people being taken to Babylon. And he slips out during the night. Why? Because he doesn't want everyone to know. kind of going covert for a minute. And you know what? Too many people asking too many questions, it's not good. And this is God's plan. He doesn't need, you know what? Nehemiah doesn't need anyone's permission. God's given him favor with the king to get him where he needs to be, but Nehemiah doesn't have to take a vote and say, what should we do? God's told him, and he's there. And he says, I hadn't told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. Why are you in Jerusalem? Because God's put this in my heart. Why God chose Nehemiah is God's choice. I don't know. Why did no one else do it? I know they got perturbed with earlier on, and they got scared and they stopped building it. We saw that in Ezra. But here's one man, and all he has is God. And yet God, before he got to Jerusalem, has already proven this is what I'll do for you. I'll help you. I'll give you. I'll speak to you. And he says, I hadn't told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. God had remember Philippians, God will give you the desire and the power. And he says, we took no pack animals with us. They're not planning to stay. They don't need anything. Pack animals carry stuff, right? They don't need that. Pack animals are needed for long journeys. He's not doing that right yet. He says, I only took the donkey I was riding. After dark, and you can start looking at this map as I say these things, it will help you. After dark, I went out through the valley gate past the jackal's well. And over to the dung gate. You know what came in out the dung gate, don't you? All right. And I went over the dung gate to inspect the broken walls and burned gates. Here it is. Here's this surreal moment. He's inspecting these walls and these burned gates. Why are they down? Why are the walls and the gates in this disrepair? Because God's people had been unfaithful. Because God, through Jeremiah and others, had said, I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming. And they said, no, you ain't. We're God's people. We're fine. And God kept telling them, I'm coming. There's going to be an army come for you. And they kept saying, no, 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 no. And these walls, even after all this time, even after the captivity is finished and they're all back and they're all doing these things, they've got the temple, but the walls and the gates are not there. And it's just this sign of defeat. And it kind of hinders their testimony, doesn't it? Like, oh, our God's so powerful, we built the temple. Yeah, but where's the wall at? He said, I went to the fountain gates and to the king's pool. But listen to this. I think they put information in like this. But my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. All of these years later, there's still just rubble. 100-odd years later, there's still rubble. And that rubble is a picture of what? What's the rubble a picture of? Yeah, war wounds, right? Disobedience. When you look at the rubble that's been there a long time, what reactions can you have? You're on your own with a few guys in the night, and your donkey can't get through the rubble, meaning there's a ton of rubble. What's your reaction? What can your reactions be? You either look at the rubble and say, what? Yeah, absolutely. 100%. There's a reason it hasn't been done all these years. Lord, I don't want to do it. My donkey, I mean, you can even say that, right? I would go there, Lord, but I can't even get through the rubble. Just give up. That's probably the majority reaction. Just give up. There's another person that looks at it and says, what? Nobody else has been able to do this, but God has called me. And God has anointed me, and God has granted me favor. And see, the exciting part is that rubble's not going to be there in much longer. We're going to turn this picture around. That rubble is no longer going to be a deterrent and no longer a sign of defeat. We're going to build these walls for the glory and honor of God. We're going to do something to make. See, so again, it's all perspective, right? And the donkey can't get through the rubble. I think that's the Bible's way of saying that kind of stuff. It triggers your emotion. Just that little sentence, the donkeys couldn't get through the rubble. You begin to picture it, don't you? And you could, like I said, you could even use that as an excuse. Lord, I'd go on my donkey, but obviously I can't. And how many people are like, hey, we can do this. That's why he's not taking many with him. And he says, verse 15, so though it was still dark, I went up to the Kidron Valley instead. So he didn't get stopped by the rubble. He just veered. He said, it was dark, but I went up the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall before I turned back. And I went back where? He went back to the village gate, right where he'd started. He sees the rubble. He can't get through. He goes up the Kidron Valley. He inspects the wall. And what's the wall screaming to his flesh? You're beaten. You can't do this. Let me explain it like this. What would happen if, and some of you have had it happen, Bill and Janelda have, what happens if your house burns down? You either look at it and go mental, or you're like, finally, a new kitchen. It's all perspective, right? It's all perspective. It's all perspective. I mean, you can either cry and go mental and say, woe is me, or you can start thinking, all right, this is a fresh start. It's a fresh beginning, something to do. And he's watching and he's inspected the wall. It's not good. There's rubble. It just looks like defeat. It's all a mess. Jerusalem is vulnerable. Verse 16, the city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing. He goes out at night, and part of that is God's protecting him, right? God doesn't want them to know, so they're not going to know. I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. Why is he not? See, I want us to this is kind of interesting, this. Why? Why he's not telling anyone about his plans? What's a mistake we make sometimes? Think about this. Let's get practical a minute. Why is that a dangerous thing to tell people about the plans that God, he's not his own plan. He's just said, God has put this in my heart. God has given me this plan. What is the danger of saying this is God's plan? Even to your family.
Kill the dream.
How?
Being an adversary against what it is that you're called to do.
Some people stand against it, right? So we don't like to share the dream because, I mean, it's for the pastor too, right? If a pastor comes and says, man, I think this is God's vision, not everyone's like, fantastic. Some people are going to buck it. Some people are going to, right? So here's what I guess I'm getting at. We have this tendency to bring in our family or to ask our best friend or to seek counsel maybe in a pastor or some spiritual person or something. And it's almost like we need okay, Nehemiah has been told by God to what? Okay, so what does it matter what anyone else says? All they can do is say, that's a good idea. I mean, they can reaffirm it, which is encouragement, right? But when God has given you, like if God has given you a calling or an anointing, what everyone else says doesn't matter. Now, again, there's always a balance here, right? If you think you're the only one that thinks you have that calling or skill set, that might be a problem. I mean, if you stand up and you teach and everyone's like, that was brutal. All right, you might say, but not every time. All right, I mean, some people think they're gifted and I've met people like that. I've had to have conversation with a guy like that. He wanted to teach. He's just not a teacher. That's a really hard conversation to have. He's just not a teacher. So there is a part of, and that's why we lay hands on people and anoint and for deacons and whoever, saying that we agree that God has called you to this. We agree to that. But this would be hard, right? You're so excited, you've got all this plan, and yet he just methodically is taking his time. That's part of resting in the Lord, right? Not jumping too quick. And he says, I hadn't said anything to anyone about my plans. I hadn't yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. I love this. Not only is he keeping this all in, but you see what we do is like, I need to contact the administration. What happens, or the officials, or the nobles, or the priests? You know what God's going to do? He's going to take care of all of that. It's kind of like if you're called to be a missionary. Imagine if you were called to be a missionary tonight to who knows where. Would you have some questions? And you'd think, but God's going to take care of all of that. You don't need to run to the priest and say, here, can you give me permission? God has already given favor. That's what he's praying for. God, just give me favor. And he has. And he said, I didn't need to go and speak to all these people to the nobles and the officials or anywhere. And we'll find out. God's just going to get them on board. God's going to do that. I had not yet spoken to the leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. God's going to put him into governor. He doesn't even run a campaign. Doesn't even collect money he doesn't even put out ads. In himself, he probably doesn't want to be governor, but God's going to make him governor for 12 years. But now I said to them, here it is. He hadn't said it, but now's the time. There was this moment where he went and he spent 3 days and he goes at night and he's kept this all in and he isn't asking them for permission. He isn't asking them if this is a good idea. He isn't asking them and saying, well, I need you on board. God's going to do all of that. But now's the time. But now, verse 17 is a transition. But now I said to them. And there's a very cool way. I want you to know, where's Nehemiah been? He's been in Persia. He's been in the luxury of a palace. He's got one of the highest official jobs in the whole land. King Artaxerxes is ruling, and he's right under him. And he's got it pretty sweet, apart from if you drink bad wine and you're dead. Other than that, it's pretty good life. But look at what he says. I love the way, there's a way of saying things, right? And there's a way, Jennifer, you know as a counselor, there's a way of encouraging people. There's a way of getting them on board. And he says to them, listen to what he says. You know very well, guys, there's no argument, right? You know very well. Please don't anyone stand up and say, what trouble are we in? You know what, don't start that. You know very well what trouble. And look at what he says. What trouble who's in? He puts himself, what? Right there with them. He doesn't come and say, oh, you guys are in trouble, I'll come in. He's just been there 3 days or whatever, right? But he's there with them. And he says, we are in trouble. This is on me too. This is us together. We're a team. He says, you know very well that what trouble we are in. And then he says, look, Jerusalem lies in ruins. If you want to argue with that, what? Look around. And its gates have been destroyed by fire. They've been destroyed by fire. That was in 586. And now we're talking about 445. Crazy how long this has taken. And he says, Jerusalem is in ruins. Its gates have been destroyed by fire. And then he just says this. Notice he doesn't say, hey guys, do you think this is a good idea? He says, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. He kind of, this is one of those like politically kind of, speak. You know how when they want you to go to war, they jive you up. Look at what he said. Let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. Let's do it, guys. And then he says, and end this disgrace. This is what it's about. The state of our city, the state of our nation, the state of these gates is a disgrace. And we should end this. And again, I don't know why it took so long. And if this was always God's purpose, I don't know. But Nehemiah is God's man at this moment. And he says, let's end this. In other words, guys, aren't you tired? Aren't you tired of going to bed thinking we have no protection? Aren't you tired of not having what God wants you to have? Aren't you tired of living in the past? Aren't you tired of all these? Aren't you tired of going down the road and looking at the rubble? Let's end it. And notice what he says, and this is the key to all of it. Let's rebuild the walls and end this disgrace, because I just got my degree in wall building. Let's end this disgrace, because I got a pot of money. Let's end this disgrace, and look at what he says. And I told them about how skilled I was. Is that what it says? I told him how the gracious hand of God had been on me. You know what he says, guys? The only way we can do this, the only way I'm interested in doing this, the only reason I'm here is because the gracious hand of God is on me. How cool is that? That's his whole stick. How are we going to do it? He that started it will complete it. God's gracious hand. Well, what about, no. God's gracious hand, he's already done it. He's already moving. And then he says, and I told them about my conversation with who? Why did he let you go? Wait, how long are you gone for? I don't know. He just gave you permission to leave? Yeah. Oh, and he signed documents so I could get timber, and he gave me his protection. He gave me his horses. He's done all. How much did that cost you? This is amazing, right? Hey, Nehemiah, how much did that cost you? Nothing. But God has put me in place years ago to build this relationship, to build this. God's doing stuff in your life you have no idea about. And when you look back, you're like, It wasn't just a job. He didn't just randomly get this job as cupbearer. God's had this. And he says, let me tell you about my conversation with the king. How did that go? It went something like, the walls are down and I want to go back. Okay. And you can have all this stuff. And look, when there's all this rubble, it's been all these years, all this stuff. But when God moves and it's his time, things start to happen. Right? Things start to change. They replied at once. They didn't talk about it. They didn't think about it. They didn't go home and schedule a meeting. They all said at once. They replied at once. You know how hard that is to give a speech and not have one try to down it? What he's selling them up front is a gracious hand of God. It's been on me. And the same God that's been on me and got me this far is the same God that's going to take us that far. If you say to Nehemiah, what's your calling card? What's going to make it? The gracious hand of God that's already been here. And he said, yes, they replied, let's rebuild the wall. Pretty awesome, huh? You imagine giving a speech and everyone's like, we're in. And it says they began the good work. I think part of this, Nehemiah has had a plan and done all of these things. And I do believe he has a plan, but he's trusting in the hand of God. See, there's that kind of, is he planning? Yes. Does he have a plan? Yes. What's his plan revolve around? God's timing, God's will, God's hand. It's all subject to change depending on where God has you or takes you, right? Okay, look, we've read the Bible enough. We've been to enough discipleship classes. They began the good work. What is coming now? You know it. Yeah. They began the good work and everything got built and nothing happened. Nah, that ain't right. Here we go. Here's these guys. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab heard of our plan. And look, God continually does this. I'm not this smart. It's exactly what we were talking about this morning. Walking, living by the power of God. It's not just, the kingdom of God is not just talk. It's not just saying, let's rebuild it. The kingdom of God is building the thing. Now, think about this. They began the good work. The king has authorized it. And all of this stuff is happening, and the enemy hates it. And so what do? It's like what we were talking about with Paul. The enemy always infiltrates you with what? Now, he can hurt your circuit. He can try and take your money and do all that stuff. But if you were trying to kill the Apostle Paul's faithfulness, you can't throw him in prison because he'll just sing and pray. If you take his money, he's content. If you take his food, he's content. If you don't have enough clothes for him, he's content. That's why he wins. How do you defeat a believer? How do you stop this rousing bunch of crazies who love God and have said, let's do it, and they start the good work? How do you do it? You try through fear or worry or shame or embarrassment. You try and come at the inner man. Exactly why Nehemiah didn't shout from the rooftops what he was doing. But they began the good work, and it says when they heard of our plan. Who do you think was speaking about the plan? God's people would have been excited. And the enemy would be like, And look at what it says. They scoffed contemptuously. What are you, what? Do you know, that might sound like a few little words. Do you know how powerful those 4 words are? You ever felt called or anointed or spoken to by God and someone asked you that? Why would you think you could do that? Who chose you to do that? And they laugh, they scoff contemptuously. What are you doing? It's what the devil does, right? It's what the devil whispers. What are you doing? In reality, you don't even have to answer the devil that question, do you? I'm doing what God's called me to do. And by the way, you're going to get beat because of his gracious right hand. What are you doing? You ever notice people come after those things? And these people have just heard the plan and they said, well, we're in. It's like people who give their life to Christ, they're in, and then the devil says, what have you just done? And all of a sudden they start to, And then he says, are you rebelling against the king? That's so stupid. Rebelling against the king will get you what? Will get you killed, but they're not rebelling against the king. The king's what? King Artaxerxes, who's in charge, basically has signed off on it. It's amazing how many people, when they're mad, just throw out stupid stuff that doesn't even make sense. Am I rebelling? Hey, you know what you're saying that? Ask him. Go ahead. Here's his number. Call him. I mean, if that's modern day, you're like, you want to call him? Call him. Even the king gets it because God's working on the king. I love this. When people come to you and say, what do you think you're doing? Maybe even your own family says that, right? Listen, we can sit here and act like everything's great and easy. I always use the same example because I think it hits home. It's somehow harder with children or whatever, right? What do you do if your kid says, I'm moving to wherever? I'm going to be a missionary. There's no running water. The last 10 missionaries that went there have all been martyred. I've preached on that so much. And Andrew's going to pull this in one day. What do you do in that moment? See, your flesh is saying what? And how many people are, if you say go with God's grace, how many people are like, wow, you're a great dad? You know how many people would come up to you and say, you stink as a father? Don't you care? Don't you know? What kind of father sent? This is where the rubber hits the road, man. Like, what are you doing? People lob all kinds of stuff at you. They try and stop you. And here's what no one knows. No one knows but Nehemiah what God has told him to do. Nehemiah, you know what Nehemiah knows without a shadow of a doubt? God has called him to this. And it's not just some random, I think he said to me, God has proven it by his hand, by his strategy. And Nehemiah knows, and I love this. Look what Nehemiah says. No. I replied, the God of heaven, the one who's all powerful and all sovereign. He doesn't say my boys and me. He doesn't say extrovert Joe the builder. He doesn't say all my cash. He doesn't say I have the experience. You see, many times we push ourselves, right? I have this and I have that. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You better have the hand of God. Who would you take? The master wall builder who didn't know God, or a guy like me who didn't have God, but somehow God could make me build a wall. That's frightening. He says the God of heaven. If you're totally reliant on God, nothing, right? The problem is we're like, well, I'm reliant on my 401k. Well, good luck with that. No, I'm reliant on my boss. He told me if I work hard, I'll get that promotion. He says we are totally reliant on one person alone, and it's God. He will help us succeed. The only way we'll succeed is him. We, his servants, Nehemiah knows it. We're just his servants. We'll start rebuilding this wall. You imagine how infuriated the devil is? We need some more men and women like this, don't we? God's going to help us succeed. We're just his servants. We will start rebuilding this wall. And I love this. Can you imagine staring at the enemy and saying, you have no share, you have no legal right, and you have no historic claim in Jerusalem? You know what we need to do? You know what we need to understand? That when you gave your life to Christ, the devil has no share, no legal right, and no claim for you at all. When you were without Jesus, the devil had a share of your life. You were under his kingship. You and the devil were pretty tight. You were his. You were his faithful follower. You lived by the flesh. You were dead in your sins. You had a share. You don't want it, but you had it. We all had a share in the kingdom of darkness. But you know how much share the kingdom of darkness has in the kingdom of light? Nothing. And he tells him in this project, and really in the spiritual overview of everything, hey, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, you have no share. You get nothing. You have no say-so. Your view is irrelevant. Why would we ever listen to the devil? You have no right, no share, no legal right. Whose is it? It's God's, right? But it's the Jews. They have no legal right to Jerusalem. And you have no historic claim. There is nothing you can bring to any judge and say, stop this. You have physically no legal right, share, or historic claim. But spiritually, man, what would that mean if we believed that about the devil? Did God really say you can't eat the fruit? Hold on. You have no share in this. You have no legal right to be talking to me or legal right. You know what the devil has over us? Nothing. He doesn't deserve a place in our ear. And yet this is how the devil works. And by the way, it's not by crazy stuff. Think about this next time. Next time you're struggling, what weapon did the devil use to try? And most of the time it works. What did the devil use to try and bring this to a halt? It's what he did last time. It's what he does a lot of. What does he use as his weapon? Which comes from what? Just words. Yeah, but it's just words. He's not threatening them with guns. He's not telling them, I'll behead you. They're not rolling up the sleeves and trying to punch him in the face. You know what the devil's ammo is? 4 tiny little silly words that would break many a person. What are you doing? 4 words. And you know what we got to be careful of? That we don't allow people to infect us by their words. And here's what we really need. You know what's coming next, don't you? You know what really we need to be aware of? That I don't infect other people with 4 silly words back. Whoever said words don't really... Some of your most depressing moments are traceable back to somebody said something. Is that all? Yeah, that's all it took. They say, is it 9 out of 10? Or I think it's 9. 1 compliment takes the place of 9 insults. It's true, right? Imagine if everybody came tonight, hugged me and said, I love you. And 1 said, I hate your guts. What would I go home thinking? What would be the first thing I told Tasha? Man, 99% of these people love me. We made it. But listen to what Karen Dean said. You'll never believe it. I'd go home what? And there could be 1,000 people here. 999 people have put me on this pedestal, right? Woo! And 1 says, It is. It is the one you think of. And no matter how, and people are like, well, yes, I get it. I know 99% with us. That's fantastic. But words, and Nehemiah doesn't, because he knows. He's got this far. He knows it's God. It's your right hand. And he stands upright and he says, God will help us. In chapter 3, this is amazing. If you'll notice, I know some of it's small. I can get them bigger if you need them. But scene 1 up here, all under these things, there's numbers 1, 2, and that correlates to the verses. If you'll see, they start and they go anti-clockwise, and they go all the way around this wall. There's every verse, yes, every verse. Those numbers are the verses. So, like scene 1 with verse 1, that's the first verse. When you get down to verse 41, it goes all the way back. And I want you to see that in 50-something days, this is all done. And I want you to see something. God achieves this. Why? Because of his right hand, because of the leadership of Nehemiah, because of the willingness of the people. And God is about to end this disgrace. And I love this. And look, I'm not going to even start to pronounce these names. You'll tell me I don't know what I'm saying, and I don't, but you don't either, so let's just avoid it, all right? The names, if the name's important, I'll let you know. If not, we're just going to move on. But you know what's really cool? And there's 1,000 things I'll probably miss in this. But I do want to tell you some of the things that have been brought to my attention. And as I've been reading this, the Lord and other preachers I've listened to. When we're reading John, or lots of other books, the priests never seem to get it, do they? Eli didn't get it. His sons didn't get it. Certainly by Jesus' day, how many high priests got it? The priests, the leaders, they were all messed up. And I love this. In verse 1, look at what it says. Eliashib, the high priest, and the other priest, they were what? They were on board. Verse 1. They started to rebuild at the sheep gate. If you can see it, it's right here, at the sheep gate, right here. They started to rebuild at the sheep gate. You follow the little arrows. You'll have to go home and study it. Get your glasses on, your light out. You'll be all right. But isn't that cool? Look, Nehemiah didn't ask what the priests thought. He speaks to them. He tells them we got to do this. He tells them God's hand's upon me. And the high priest and the other priests. And by the way, that kind of would be a sad indictment on the Jews, wouldn't it? We got our walls back, but our priests are AWOL. And yet in the very first moment, the Jews, the high priest, the other priests, they start to rebuild at the sheep gate. They dedicate. This is amazing. They dedicated it. And by the way, do you know? Why are they on the sheep gate? Here's a really hard question for you. What came through the sheep gate? Well done, Stanley. Yeah, that's it. The sheep that were going to, sacrificial sheep, would enter the temple courts through that gate. Guess who's over that? Guess who it makes sense has a heart for that? See, God is giving the priests a heart for that which would minister to them. I mean, who would you put over the sheep gate? Yeah, but most of the time the priests are so messed up you'd have to bypass them. But praise God, Nehemiah can say, hey, you're a priest, right? Yep. Why don't you take the sheep gate? And they're like, yes, that sounds awesome. And they started to rebuild the sheep gate. They dedicate, and by the way, every time the priest would take the sheep through, they would remember. They dedicated and set up his door. They dedicated, they prayed over it. They gave it over to God. God, we're doing this. We're rebuilding the sheep gate, and only by your power will it go up, and only by your power will it what? Stand. And they set up its doors, its building, the wall as far as the Tower of the 100. The Tower of the 100 and the Tower of Hananiel were fortifications because there was no natural protection. And so they built these towers. And it strikes me, isn't that weird? When did the priests have to build walls or rebuild gates? That's not in their job description, is it? I mean, they were to sacrifice. But God, do you see that God can empower you and give you a gift when you need it? These priests aren't just old men that can't do it. They're doing it. They're building the walls. And they build it as far as the Tower of the 100, which you can see on this deal. So is that a massive bit? I mean, we've gone from here to here. Is that massive? No, this is going to be the whole point of the next few weeks. God doesn't need one person to do this whole thing. And God isn't saying, oh, you did more wall than them. God, listen, this task is too big for anybody on their own. And even if you know it, and even if you basically do it, with not much help, there's a reason it took Noah a long time, right? You might get it done, but you know how long it's going to take you? And what are the chances of you getting it done before you just bust out because you can't take it no more? And this is the problem, and it's come to me again this week. My job isn't to build these walls on my own. And thank God, because if I'm your wall builder, you know what my job is? To equip you to build the wall. For you to find your place and say, the sheep gate. Yeah, and you know what? There's a bit of maturity. I wanted the sheep gate. Settle down. It makes sense for the priest to have the sheep gate, right? On our own, you know what we'll do? I want that part. Why? Oh, that'll be the part that everyone sees. Oh, that's the easy part. And it was person by person. You know what? You know what a little bit of wall adds up to? A little bit of wall that you make. And a little bit of wall that I make. And a little bit of wall that you make. And all of a sudden, you know how many miles of walls you have? And God, there's going to be crazies that are mentioned twice. One guy gets on the front end and the back end. He's a show-off, right? And yet the priests started. I love this because normally you can't say much great about priests. I imagine when we get to heaven, did you read Nehemiah with priests sometimes? Yeah, I got you. I got you. They dedicated. And then this is amazing. I'm telling you, it keeps coming up. Neighbors helping. Look at verse 2. This is unbelievable. Read this. People from where? All right. What do you know about Jericho? Hold on. What do you know about Jericho? What were they great at? Hold on. What was their whole stick? What was the city of Jericho? What was their whole thing? It was their double thick walls, right? So people in Jericho were known for what? The advert would go something like the walls of, Jericho, building walls since God blew them down. But why are people from Jericho jumping on this? Why? This is what I've been telling you. Neighbors are coming to Lawrence Drive. Why is Jericho showing up and saying, we want to be a part of this? You know what the people of Jericho benefit from this? Hold on. They benefit greatly. You know what their benefit is? If I'm from Jericho, you being safe in Jerusalem doesn't do me much good. It's kind of like going on mission trips when you build stuff, right? What you're building doesn't really benefit. Okay, you do that. There's a few in here that do that. If you go on a missions trip and you build something, it doesn't really benefit you. Whether they're in nice rooms or not, that doesn't affect your life. So what's the buzz? What's the joy of doing that? Because when you do that, God's going to bless you somehow. You get to bless them. You get to help them. But tell me God doesn't bless you. And even the godless people in Jericho we're in. And by the way, why would they be in on God's wall building project? Maybe there's a rumor in Jericho. And you know what Jericho brings to the table? It's not their wall building skills. They might be good at building walls and look, the wall, other than God blowing them down, you weren't getting into Jericho. So they're not bad wall builders. You've got to really concentrate. They're not really bad at that. But and I realize this is older people now, we're ways from Joshua. But what would the people of Jericho bring to the table more than I can build a wall? I know what happens when you come against the hand of God. And you know how powerful a lesson that is? Dude, I don't care how good at wall building you are. It's more powerful to come and tell you, listen, in my ancestry, you know what our history is? The only thing we need, Rahab, a prostitute, figured it out. We need the hand of God because it don't matter. Nehemiah, I'll tell you this. You imagine the people from Jericho. Nehemiah, I'll tell you this. Unless we have the hand of God, what's the point? And the people in Jericho, I believe, are there because of the memorial stones from. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. People from the town of Jericho work next to them. God's doing all of it. He's bringing people from Jericho, and you know what? They're working together. Can you imagine some of the Jews would be like, well, why are you here? God put these, then next to the priests were these people from the town of Jericho. And they worked next to them, and beyond them was that guy. The fish gate. This gave easy passage to cities' fish markets. The fish gates were built by the sons of Hassenaah, or whatever his name is. But do you see already? We got the priests did their thing, right? You got the people from Jericho. They did their thing. And now you've got the fish gate. They laid the beams, set it up its doors, and installed its bolts and bars. So these sons of Hassenaah, they only had one job. You see, all of a sudden, you imagine saying, we got this project. Oh, man. No. You just do the fish gate. That's it. That's all you want me to do. Just the fish gate. Do it to the best of your ability. Just do the fish gate. Just do it. Lay the beam, set up its doors, installed its bolts and bars. And then in verse 4, Uriah's son, let's call him that, and his grandson repaired the next section of wall. So the fish gate, then there's this next bit of wall is down, and so they build that. Beside him was the son of Berechiah and grandson of Meshabel, and then Zadok, son of Banana, or whatever his name is. All right. Verse 5, listen to this. This is crazy, and you already see the tension building a little bit. So you got this section, the priest. This next section, those from Jericho. The fish gate is taken care of. The next section of wall that is derelict is taken care of. And then these people from Tekoa come. These people from Tekoa, they're in it. And here again, and who knows what's happened to these leaders. But it says the leaders refuse to work with the supervisors. The people of Tekoa come, they're working, and their leaders back out. And yet the people say, if you're backing out, Godspeed, but we're not. Their leaders backed out. They couldn't work. They refused to work, probably because pride and who knows what. Go to verse, and I'll finish. There's so much, but we've got weeks to do it, so. Look at verse 21. Someone read that. Verse 21.
Next to him, Merimoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakaz, repaired another section from the entrance to Elisha's house to the end of it.
Who's that? Read verse 4. Same dude. Same dude jumped on in verse 4 and verse 21. Guess what? He's doing it again. He didn't just do one part of it. He's doing two parts of it. Look at verse 27. Someone read verse 27. the people whose leaders wouldn't help.
Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section from the great projecting tower to the wall of opal.
So, not only did the people of Tekoa say, forget the leaders, we're going, because God's hand and God's voice is way more important than my leaders. Look, they don't just say, hey, we're going to do it. They do another bit. They're in verse 5 and they're in verse 27. They did the same thing. The verse 5, the leaders wouldn't submit. We'll get into this next week. There's so much stuff. You can go and study this, go and read this map. If you want to ask questions, I want to pray a minute. Look, the obvious inference where we're going in this is Corinthians and Romans, where it talks about the body of Christ and how everything works together. You realize what we're looking at here is a picture of how church should be? That's where we're headed with all of this. This is a picture of the church. This is how you get it done. There's so much. Listen, we'll be here. That's why we got another 10 or 11 weeks or whatever. But let me read this and let me just put this in your ear or mind. Look at verse 8, and we'll come back next week. God was using all kinds of people. And it was like for this moment, he just transformed them. It says in verse 8, Uziel was a goldsmith by trade. He's just a goldsmith. But you know what he said? Forget being a goldsmith. I'm in. And he began to work on the wall. Check this out. Beyond him was Hananiah, a manufacturer of what?
Perfume.
Imagine if you were in construction management. I want a job building the wall. Great. What's your line of work? I manufacture perfumes. What? Yeah, I manufacture perfumes. I'll be right good for this job. Their life is wrapped up in manufacturing perfumes. And yet, God's called them. Just check that a minute. You mean God was speaking to people who were in the perfume industry and saying, stop that for a moment and come and work for me? But I was just working on my bestseller. You wonder if they were like, hey, you smell. Here's my perfume. They're just perfume manufacturers. And yet God says, this is what we were saying this morning. I'm going to show you about the power of God at work. I'm going to take a perfume guy and make him build a wall, because that's what God can do. And I'm not saying he couldn't. Maybe he was expert in building a wall, but it's amazing that was his line of work, and all of a sudden he walked away and said, forget that. There's a project here that I can't stop being a part of. How many of us would be willing to put a business on hold for a thing of God's? All come with the excuse, well, I'm in perfume. If you want me to give perfume away, I'm your man. There's a lot. Read this map, get familiar with it. It's really cool. There's some really interesting stuff. You can read about why the sheep gate. I've told you the sheep. The dung gate is where they took the dung out. All kinds of stuff. You've got priest houses, you've got the broad wall, you've got all of this stuff. And God's going to take care of all of it. Does anyone have any questions, any thoughts, anything I've missed? And then we'll pray. I'll just open up to pray and we'll be through.